My name is Derek Appel. I go online as Derp. Don't ask me why. I don't know these things. Today we're going to be talking about a certain kind of subject in mind. This is not a very happy or pleasant, or it's exciting in some cases, but overall we are talking about one of the gruesome and most horrific conflicts in history. Now, history is pretty prevalent in video games. It's been one of the main kind of go-tos for games like Medal of Honor, Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty games. Untold number of games use history as a basis for its narrative, for its story, its world, and pretty much just everything. And that's pretty much how I got my love into history. Playing games like Call of Duty and Medal of Honor as a kid and learning that these things actually happened. Like, I'm actually playing events that actually happened and people actually participated in. Events that actually affected people. And that's what really drove me towards from video games to history. Because when you really think about history, you know, when you think about that word, you think of the subject in school, right? You think of black and white photos, or just a line of dates in a timeline with random descriptions, or just things that barely dig underneath the surface. History is the story of us as people, it's the story of how we are where we are today. And it's a wonderful story. It's a fantastic story. It's a tremendous story. It's full of everything a good story has. You have, you have action, drama, and tragedy. And unfortunately, this is one of those aspects, tragedy. Some action too, but it's, kind of glorified in all that aspects. But we are going to be talking about the First World War today. Now, you've noticed these games up here, they're all set in the Second World War. The Second World War makes sense for a video game, because when you're playing a video game, and especially if you're following a video game story, you want something that is like a good versus evil kind of narrative, right? It makes sense. You are the hero of your story. You're going around and going through the hero's journey, meeting characters that'll help you on your journey, and eventually defeating the big villain and all that. In this case, it being Nazi Germany. Now, a minority of people would say that's not the case. Let's not worry about those people. And it's easy for that for video games. It's a little different for when you talk about the first. And it's kind of weird, and it makes sense though, because in America, the war is not taught well here, and that's because we weren't in it that long. Countries like Britain and France and Germany and Russia, parts of their culture are defined by this conflict. You say the words like the Somme or Verdun. That has no meaning here. No one's going to say, well, you say that to somebody, you're going to get well, what is that? I don't know what that is. If you say those words to somebody in Britain or France, especially in France, Verdun is very, very much a big part of just French conscience and culture. And if you say that word has a very different meaning there. And really what we're going to be talking about is, how video games could represent that, and if a video game can represent that. And lo and behold, here we go, Battlefield 1. This was released a couple years ago. Right now, Battlefield 5 is actually coming out. It's about the Second World War. I don't think it's going to be as, better. And it was really, this is really the first attempt that a AAA studio made an attempt at telling something about this war. Ubisoft had Valiant Hearts, I think a couple years ago, but that was more like an indie game. But really much, big video game companies never really touched the war, because the war wasn't cut and dry, good versus evil, or anything like that. This was a war that really had no good reason of happening at all, period. And being able to tell that kind of narrative in a video game, that's a challenge, because you have to build your narrative off of that and being able to try and tell a story through that. Now, that can be done. If you research into this war and you actually go through like people's accounts, there are amazing, wonderful, incredible stories of people just managing to survive and do the most incredible things a human could do in the worst possible environments you could ever imagine a human being being in. And it's wonderful. And it's not just that, but it's a huge, gigantic subject that would take forever to go on. And the only thing we can really go on from here is how the game represented the game, which was in war stories. But before we begin, I just want to do a quick rundown of the war, just to tell you how horrible it was. It was one of the most horrific and brutal conflicts in human history, bar none. That is not an exaggeration. 15 to 19 million people died. That is in total of both military and civilian casualties. 23 million of those were wounded. About 9 to 11 million of the overall casualties were military soldiers. And that casualties being dead, wounded, or missing, or people who just never came home, which happened quite a lot when you get hit by an artillery shell and no one can find where your body parts are, which was a very common occurrence. It created the world that we live in today. And that's a kind of a grandiose statement to make, but when you think about it, it makes sense. Without the First World War, we don't have what we now know as the modern Middle East. After the war, Britain and France would partition it, and it would generally make Iraq, Iran, Syria, those nations exist because of the end of the war. Because of the First World War, we don't see the rise of extremist political movements like fascism and communism. Speaking of that, without the First World War, we don't see the rise of the Soviet Union and therefore a Cold War. Without the First World War, we don't see the beginnings of the stepping stones that America takes to become the superpower that it is today. And without the First World War, we don't start seeing massive, extremely different ideas being accepted by the norm, like women's rights or civil rights, or in general, like even women's clothing. After the war, it became a trend for women to wear like higher up skirts. You know, we're talking about women were wearing ankle skirts at the time. Afterwards, there was kind of this idea in society that, you know, nothing really matters, who cares? And the war, you know, for something to happen to a society like that, it needs a gigantic, huge event. And that's what we're talking about today. So how did the war start? I'm going to be really quick about this. This is going to be really confusing. That's because it's meant to. And this also, I have a map up here that I borrowed from The Great War, which is a YouTube channel that is fantastic. I used some of their videos for the research of this panel. And if you have the chance, if you want to look deeper into the subject, wonderful channel, wonderful content, I recommend it. So, without further ado, if it's kind of hard to see by the light, I'm sorry. In 1914, Serbia, little old Serbia in the Balkans, is having a little bit of trouble with Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary is basically like an old kind of empire that's made up of many, many different cultures, and like 15 different languages were the official languages of the nation. And they wanted to, and Serbia was kind of like a thorn on their side, and they kind of wanted to annex them. Don't forget, I don't remember the date, but in 1914, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary gets assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist and a member of the Black Hand, which was a Serbian terrorist organization. The Austrians blamed Serbia for this because they thought that the plot to assassinate the heir to the throne was funded by Serbian intelligence. No one really knows, but it makes sense. Austria gives Serbia a list of demands, saying, you need to let us effectively run your country now. You no longer have sovereignty. Serbia says, fuck you. Austria says, no, fuck you, and we're going to war. So they declare war. But Serbia has a little friend. He has a big friend, and it's Russia. Russia is seen as the is like the guardian of the Slavic peoples, right? The Russian Empire has stood for, you know, a couple centuries, and they've seen as like the traditional guardian of the Slavic peoples. So they tell Austria, no, don't you fucking do it. Germany, who is allied to Austria-Hungary, goes to Russia and says, no, you don't fucking do it. And then declares war on Russia after Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Now, people kind of want to blame Germany for this because Germany essentially gives Austria-Hungary a blank check to do whatever they want with Serbia. And that's kind of like one of the reasons why they think this was what started it off. Now, Russia has another friend, and he's all the way over to the west in France. France is one of the biggest empires in Europe at the time, only really second to Britain at the time, and I think they're kind of equal footing with Germany. France has an alliance with Russia, and Germany looks at France and goes, hey, this little thing happening east, you're cool, right? What are you going to do? Like, what are your plans for this? And France says, well, we're going to honor our agreements. To which Germany says, okay, cool. Go ahead and give us all your forts on our border right there. Give us the keys. We're not going to do anything else with them. Just give us all your forts, and we'll go about your way. It's a show of good faith for you. The French say, no, fuck you. And the Germans say, okay, no, fuck you. And they declare war on France. Now, the thing about that border, though, is it's heavily fortified. If you attack that border or try to cross it, everybody's dead. So Germany has a plan. They have a plan to send most of their army through tiny Belgium up in the north, swing around into France from its undefended north side, and take Paris. Meanwhile, the rest of their army would hold off the Russians until France was defeated and they would go up. Sounds like a good plan on paper. Except Belgium says, no, I don't want this. And the Germans say, well, no, just let us move our army through your country and you'll be fine. And the Belgians say, no, fuck you. And the Germans say, okay, no, fuck you. And they go to war with Belgium. There is one problem to this. Belgium has a friend. Belgium has a friend, and his name is Great Britain. Belgium is actually protected by a treaty for its independence. And one of the signatories was Germany, ironically enough. And here they are invading them and taking their territory and, all that, and annexing them. Britain says, hey, get out of Belgium. And Germany says, no. And Britain says, okay, fuck you. And they go to war. And that is how the war starts. It's a little confusing and a little drawn out, and that's the point. And common people at the time didn't understand why it started. There were like villages in Russia that were full of illiterates, and someone would go and be like, all right, guys, we got to go get those Germans. And that was literally it. There was no other reason why it happened. Or he's like, come on, we got to go. And they just went. So for common people, it was very just much like, okay, we're at war now, I guess. But the very, complicated reasonings of that go a little deeper. Now, how does a video game tell this kind of story of what's about to happen? War stories. That was DICE's answer. DICE decided to do this into a kind of segmented 6-part kind of campaign with each character. Each character would be in a different part of the war, different field, or a different area. And their intent was to show different sides of the war that no one really, knew about. They didn't really do a good job. Really, what it's, one of the things they always said like that was, we want to tell stories of the people in the war. And it's, that's a great thing to say, but they didn't do that in practice. And this first part of the campaign, we're going to go through it progressively, and we're going to go look in each story and do a little brief thing. So, the first kind of chapter in the game, the intro, you are shown as cinematic as a Harlem Hellfighter, an African-American soldier in World War I. The actual level, you don't play as him, so I don't know why they bother showing him or at all. You play as a succession of random soldiers, and you're not expected to live. And that's actually kind of the one part where this game gets right, of the kind of needlessness and the randomness of the war and just the odds you had of surviving, which was very, very little. That's one of the key parts that it got right. But it didn't do anything to tell the Harlem Hellfighters story. It didn't do anything to tell anything about what they did or anything like that. So we're going to go over that. Now, the Harlem Hellfighters were initially, and this is the guy on the cover of the game too, they decided to put a Harlem Hellfighter on the cover of the game, and that was it. They decided, oh, that was enough. And I think that's kind of disrespectful. Not disrespectful, but it's I don't like it. Originally, they were called the 369th Infantry Regiment, and they were a New York National Guard unit. Now, back then in America, and probably still, racism was kind of a big thing. And it was only very recently at the time that African Americans were allowed to serve in the army as just infantry or in other duties. And before they were kind of disallowed on that, except for Buffalo Soldiers, like they were kind of experimenting with that. And the army didn't really have any kind of policies as regards to segregation or integration or anything like that. So it kind of was just left up in the air. And because of that at the time, a lot of white officers and men were, you know, incredibly racist. So these men had to go through that at home. And when they were called to go to France in 1917, they weren't given combat training. They weren't given anything like that. They weren't expected to fight. They were supposed to be in labor battalions doing menial work, like digging latrines and building camps and crap like that, you know. You know, these people signed up to fight for their country, a country that saw them as not really even citizens, really. And they signed up and want to do this because they want to prove that they are worthy of it and they can fight for their country, and that because of that, and they're willing to go that extra mile to serve, they should be given the same things everybody else gets in the country, namely, you know, whites. Now, the Hellfighters were one of the most decorated American units in the war. They were on the front for 191 days, on the front line for the longest period of any American unit in the war. They also suffered the most casualties. They suffered around 1,500 casualties, dead, wounded, missing. This was the highest number of any American unit as well. They were actually not technically part of the American Army. They were given to the French. The reason for this being was that white officers refused to fight with them or serve alongside them. They thought they were, you know, they're blacks. We don't want to serve with them, you know, that kind of thing. Now, Pershing, John Pershing, the commander of the American Army, decided on a compromise. He decided to just give these guys to the French Army because the French Army already had colored troops in the form of Algerians and North Africans. And they gave them, and the American Army gave them this document. And if you ever read this document, I think it's called SICBAT. It's called Concerns in Commanding Black American Troops. I think that's what the abbreviation is. And if you read this, it is one of the most racist, disgusting pieces of literature you would ever read. It is one of the most racist documents you could ever find. It's on Google Books and it's free if you want to look it up, but it is horrible. It is a pamphlet specifically telling the French how to treat African American troops, and one of the lines from there was, don't praise them too much and don't give them too much commendation because that'll affect how they view themselves back home as people. Really fucked up shit, right? Now, how bad it was? The French, who were an empire at the time, who participated in the colonization of Africa, you know, all that shit, all that kind of racist stuff, they looked at this and went, ugh, and just fuck it, and they burned every copy they received. It was that bad. It was horrible. And the French disregarded this and they said, you know, we just want help. So they got help, and the Hellfighters gave them the help, and they did it admirably. They got their name allegedly from the Germans. There's no really concrete source, but allegedly the Germans would call them that. And altogether, the Hellfighters would win 170 Croix de Guerre, which is the French equivalent of the Medal of Honor here. It's France's highest military honor. 170 of these as a unit collectively. Some of the most greatest war heroes of the war come from this regiment, like Henry Johnson, who fought off a 30-man German patrol with another soldier, which is nothing but a knife and a pistol, killing 4 men by himself and maybe wounding 30 more, and basically beating off an attack by himself. You know, he didn't get a Medal of Honor until, I think, during Obama's term as president. 100 years. Also, this war happened 100 years ago. If that's crazy. I just want to point that out real quick. But, you know, this regiment needs a war movie. It really does. Because their motto is fucking badass. It's goddamn let's go. Like, imagine a bunch of pissed off black soldiers going to charge against a German machine gun nest, and just that kind of war movie kind of view, and just go, God damn, let's go. It's awesome. We need to see that, and people, we haven't seen that yet, and I think that should change. But the game, again, it doesn't tell any of this. You're not given any of this. You're given an individual who wakes up in a cinematic in a hospital and has a flashback to the war. That's it. There's no story told there. There's nothing. It's not right. And for a company to say that they are interested in telling stories about the people in the war and how they went through, and to be able to just have this amazing amount of material and not use it, I don't think they tried hard enough. But moving on, I have a little thing up here actually too, a cool little thing. This is a propaganda poster used for it, and it shows the Hellfighters. Now, just as a little quick note, back then, if you would see like African Americans in art, it was usually not in the positive light. They were usually represented as stereotypes and like shit you would see at the Museum of Tolerance. And this is not the case. These men are represented heroically and stoically, doing their duty for for God and country. And for these men to have the reasoning of wanting to serve, to prove to those in power that they are people too, and they are willing to fight and die just as they are for them, for their freedoms. And I think that right there, it's a small thing, but I think something like this to come out of that, I think it worked a little bit. And I think, and you would see a lot of civil rights stuff start happening after the war as well. And that's where you see like the beginnings of that too. Henry Johnson would be one of the first civil rights leaders. But moving on to, we're going on to the second chapter, which is, I also got to make sure I'm not like dragging on and everything. Well, we got time. We got plenty of time. Awesome. So the war was also known for a couple of different things, mainly the modernization of war. Before the war, we had the Industrial Revolution happen across the Western world, where things like factories and industry and just, those things really came into being in society. And that showed in this war. Inventions like the machine gun, flamethrowers, barbed wire, these things were used for the first time en masse. They were used before in different wars before, but this time it was used in like a big, giant conflict. And the results were catastrophic. That's one word I'd use. But one of these inventions, which is a staple of modern warfare now, is tanks. Now, in the chapter, if you ever seen Fury with Brad Pitt, the campaign chapter is like that, but with the British. And you are playing as a driver, and really you're playing as the whole crew in this Mark V gigantic big metal box of a tank, and that's what tanks were back then. They were basically just giant metal boxes with gigantic fucking treads on them. And because no one really knew what they were doing at the time, like the closest thing you could think of is like that looks kind of like a mobile fort almost, with like all these guns sticking out everywhere, every place. But these two, along with planes, would become like the visual representations of this war. But at the time, though, tanks weren't that effective initially. These were incredibly slow. The fastest of them would go 4 miles per hour, which is that of a walking human. Like, it would be that fast. Everything else would be like a slow crawl. It's because these things are so huge, and the engines at the time were so. It's not like a 1,200 horsepower engine or anything we would have these days. It very much just like barely able to keep this thing moving, and it also took a lot of them took like 10 to 20 people to crew effectively. And if you look at these things, you can't imagine like 10 to 20 people like fitting into them. It's crazy. And it's being able to do your job in that, and being in a tank was absolutely miserable too, because you're in this big metal box. There's no light. There's no electricity. There's no light except for like maybe a little tiny viewports in the hull. The entire tank is built around the engine. So it's just one giant engine inside your tank, and it is loud. It is incredibly loud. loud enough you can't hear anything even if you're screaming at the top of your lungs. The way people had to communicate was by kicking each other in the back. A driver would have to be like told, if you were kicked in the right shoulder, that's a right turn. Kicked in the left shoulder, that's a left turn, and all that. And communication is impossible. So in the game, when you see them going in the tank and talking to each other, I think it's kind of funny because that would not have happened. These people were able to hold conversations. Well, normally you just wouldn't. It would just be a giant just engine noise. That's all it would be. And they weren't used. You can go to the next slide. They weren't used as well as they were used like now. Nowadays, we look at tanks as like big mobile kind of just, they punch a hole and they just go. They just go real fast. They can't be penetrated, or they could, but very hard to. And just death machines, right? These were incredibly intimidating at the time because, you know, in a war, in an era where you see cavalry still, and it's just kind of 19th century old school kind of, you know, views of war, you see this giant hulking, like almost like it's like if we saw a mech today just come out of nowhere, like from Mech Warrior or something, right? It's like if you see that coming towards you, like, Jesus Christ, what the hell is that thing? And they had that effect, but they were incredibly slow, and if you could isolate them, you could very easily take them out. There's a scene in the chapter where a bunch of German soldiers swarm on top and they start banging on the hull, and the crew's like shooting out of the hole to get them off and everything. And you fly a carrier pigeon out to call for an artillery strike, and it's a nice serene moment and cool and all that. But they wouldn't have had time to do that. They would have most likely been dead or captured. And being in those kind of crews was very, very dangerous and miserable and awful. In the game, too, you kind of go out of the tank and go around. You're kind of by yourself behind enemy lines. That generally didn't happen, mainly because tanks wanted to stay as close to any kind of friendly units as possible because there's no communication, there's no radio. Radio existed at the time, but they weren't put into tanks until well into the Second World War. So your only solution was like to gut out of the tank and shout at somebody or with a flag or something. So, you know, there wasn't any kind of, as far as I know, any kind of incident where a tank crew was like behind enemy lines or anything. So, but you know, if you know, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. But it doesn't really. It's a good story. I think it's the best part of the game, but it's in terms of like showing how like a crew actually fought and like how a tank crew really was or anything like that. No. Also, I forgot the no part in the first part, so I'm just going to say no. And now we move on to this third part, which is the other side of the coin of the modernization, modernization of Warcoin, is planes. Aviation wasn't really seen as a major part of anything really in society. It was kind of like a novelty. Balloons were more looked at as like a more practical military use than planes. And planes were so new. They were this new that American pilots initially were actually trained by the Wright brothers. It was that new and that like kind of like uncharted territory. But it became like they initially were used for reconnaissance. So they would be flown over an area and they would look, see where the enemy is, report back, land, and tell them. Usually that was a job for the cavalry, but now you had something that could go up and look down, and that was incredibly effective. There's also a different kind of time, because in the first year of the war, pilots initially didn't shoot at each other. If they flew past each other, they would just wave. And it's that kind of like 19th century mindset seeping through of just like that honor and like, you know, that kind of almost chivalrous kind of mindset that people had at the time, clashing against 20th century reality. Because soon after that, they started shooting at each other with pistols and shotguns. And then they started putting machine guns on their planes, willing to shoot through the wooden propeller blades to shoot down their enemy and then bail out. Initially, they made an invention to fix that, but people were willing to do that. And pilot lives were incredibly dangerous. Planes back then were not made out of metal. When you see a plane explode in the game, it's like a fiery, explosive, like cinematic storm. These planes were made out of canvas and wood, except for the engine and like the controls. These things, like you could tip one over. Like if I had one here, I could tip one over on its side. They were that light. And bullets are made out of metal. So it's not, you're not gonna, if you get hit, it's not like in World War II where your plane is made out of metal. You might survive, you might not. No, if it gets it's through, it's going through. And these things were incredibly dangerous. Despite popular belief, these pilots were not given parachutes. Parachutes existed at the time. They actually existed past the experimental stage. But, and this is also this 19th century mindset that people had. People refused to give their pilots parachutes because they saw them as a tool of cowardice. They looked at them and thought, well, if a pilot's going to have this and he goes into combat with the enemy, he's just going to jump out of his plane. So let's not just don't give them to them, because then they'll they'll get a way out. You know, they can't have a way out. They need to die for their country. That kind of mindset is also why you see that many deaths and battles in the war. Because back then, dying for your country was seen as a great and amazing thing to do for you. And I don't think nowadays it is, because we've seen the results of that. Oh, cool. No, that's no problem. And it's, a pilot's life was incredibly short. You can see why. In the game, it's like the character is like this kind of Han Solo gruff scoundrel character, and it's okay. It's not anything. It doesn't tell any kind of relatable story in terms of that kind of narrative. It just kind of goes around. Good Lord, Windows, what the hell? But the other thing too was balloons too. Balloons were also a big part, and you can see in the corner there, past there's a big Zeppelin, which are these kind of big long cigar blimps essentially, and they would go, and they were used as bombers at first. Like you think, oh my God, like Windows, come on, please. All right. And they would be, they were used as, tools of terror. They would fly these over London, and that actually happened in the game. You defeat a Zeppelin raid, and that actually happened. They would send fighters up there to fight these things, and they would actually shoot them down, which wasn't a good thing for the crew, because you have a giant balloon full of explosive or flammable gas. Not really a lot of them survived. But in terms of how it represents how being a pilot in the war was, and the kind of things you would have to go through, going up in the air day in and day out in this rickety death machine, you might just die in a horrible, horrible death. Like, there's no way you're getting out. There's no radio between these things either. Like, you can't communicate with anybody else. You just have to keep your eyes on them. If you get lost, you get lost. You might not be able to come home. You might just end up behind enemy lines and get shot down. You might crash and burn and die. It's like a very new thing that no one really knew what to do with, and it shows. But in terms of, does the game show that? No, it doesn't. But a cool thing about the game is that it actually does show places that no one really knows about the war. One of them being the Italian front. Italy joined the war actually on the Allied side in the middle, like kind of 1915, in the middle of the war, purely for territorial reasons, for selfish reasons. The other nations and big great powers went to war because of a web of alliances and honoring those. Italy joined, and they were actually technically allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they almost joined the war on their side, but they decided to stay neutral. They wanted to take the Austrian territories of Trentino and Trieste. These were Italian areas that had Italy claimed they had its Italian-speaking majorities, and that's why, and these were called in Italian culture the irredeemed lands. And the irredentists would be a major nationalist move in Italy that's not, it feeds into this, but we're not going to talk about that because it's interesting, but it's massive. And Austria held those territories, and Italians were part of the empire. So Italy joins because Austria-Hungary is kind of like the dejected stepchild of the Central Powers, because they don't do anything right. They will either make a gigantic mistake or screw up somewhere, lose 750,000 men, 1 million men, and go to Germany like, can you help us? Can you bail us out, please? Just this one more time. I'll get my act together. I swear, just please help me. That was what Austria-Hungary was. So Italy sees that and goes, well, we can take these irredeemed lands for Italy. And that was a popular movement at the time. And it fed into the fanaticism of that by the Italians, fed into this in this front of how brutal and unforgiving this was. There were entire units in the Italian army called the Arditi, which you actually play as an Arditi in the campaign. These men are the equivalent of the German stormtroopers, which were the specialized units that were designed to break through trenches on the Western Front, and instead of mindlessly charging the machine gun fire, actually finding weak points using modern-day infantry tactics that we use today now to overcome them. And the Italians had their own version. They were called the Arditi, and they were fanatical. They were expected, each unit was expected to die to the last man if needed, and that happened multiple times. Multiple units of these would just be wiped out clean. And what made this worse, and not just them, but like the Italian army as a whole, and the reason for that is because where it's at. Northern Italy is where the Alps are. It's just mountains. And you're expecting a modern army to fight through this like you would a field. And it doesn't work that way. When an artillery shell hits the ground, like in a field, it does its damage, but the ground kind of absorbs the impact. It takes some of it. When it hits a mountainside or a rock wall or anywhere in this area, because everything is rock, it does that, but then the rock itself becomes part of the explosion. So you have way more shrapnel from these weapons and many more casualties as a result. It was brutal. You couldn't dig trenches in these areas. You would have to get heavy equipment and drillers to be able to do that. And that took time to bring up because it's the mountains. So they would have to sometimes resort to piling rocks on each other as walls for trenches. And those didn't hold up to artillery either. So you had this just gigantic, unique hellhole in a conflict full of hellholes. But this one has its own unique kind of sinister twist to it. And this front is also marked by the incompetence of the officers at the time. The Italian command in that war was probably one of the most stupidest group of individuals you could ever find. In this front, there were, when you study a war, there are battles and they're named. So there's to signify, what those battles were and how they affected the war. There were 12 battles of the Isonzo River, which was a river that ran through that region. There were 12 of them. They all ended in Italian defeat. Every single one of them. I'm not kidding you. Every single one of them. Someone decided that after the first time, oh no, it'll work this time. The third time, no, this time. The sixth time, no, this time it'll work. The 10th time, no, this'll work. The 12th time, we just lost half of Italy. That is how the war went for the Italians. Just defeat after defeat after defeat, and just deaths. Lists of people just dead. And that kind of, that affecting that nation, it led to the rise of fascism and Mussolini. Mussolini was actually one of the people who, was like the father of fascism. Hitler actually took notes from him and actually used his writings to build up the Nazi party. Fun little fact for it. And he also served in this war too. He was actually kind of a communist in the war, and he kind of did like a double flip. It was kind of it's interesting, but it's one of the most brutal areas of the war, and it's marked by just endless brutality. Just people being in this situation, in this environment, in a like I said, a hellhole in a area full of hellholes, and having to survive that. Now, in the game, this is kind of like the biggest crime that DICE did. In the game, you are a character who has a giant armored suit carrying a heavy machine gun, and you're running up 90-degree cliff faces full sprint. Now, I'm not one of those people that's like, video games need to be realistic, and you can't, you have to drink every 3 minutes or something like that. But what the fuck? And the Arditi weren't that at all. Armor was used in the war, but the Arditi were actually really light. They were light troops who would almost sometimes not even have a weapon in certain points in battles. They would just fight with bare hands. They were that fanatical. And the story itself is a guy who was an Arditi recounting this to a child, and it's kind of like a tropey war movie kind of thing. He finds he's trying to look for his brother, and his brother dies, and it's sad. But it doesn't touch on any of those. It doesn't touch on any of the aspects of what Italy went through and all the unique little like sinister tidbits of the war. Like you just kind of go through, and it's really just a tropey war movie segment in a video game, and it's disappointing. So does the Italian part of War Stories, Battlefield 1, accurately represent how the Italian front was in the First World War? No. No, it doesn't. Moving on, though, we're actually going to another part of the war, and if you're starting to see, if you'll notice something, if you know a little bit about the war, you'll notice something. None of these places are set in the Western Front, which was where you see what the war is like, what it's known for: trenches, stalemate, mud. You know, any kind of picture from that, it's from that, and that's what the war is mainly known for. And I'll give DICE credit that they actually tried to point at certain points of people that, like, you know, events that people didn't really know. One of them is Gallipoli. Gallipoli is a peninsula in Turkey, and Turkey actually was known as the Ottoman Empire. Was a you notice a trend here, multinational and cultural empires in this kind of era. The Ottomans ruled over what we know as the Middle East, and Turkey. They used to actually hold parts of Europe as well as in Greece and kind of the Slavic area regions. But they joined Germany during the war, and there was a group of people on the Allied side who wanted to take the war in other parts because the stalemate on the Western Front was so bad. They needed areas to have a success in, have any kind of victory in. So Winston Churchill, if you've heard of him, he's kind of an asshole, but he's a known figure. He came up with the idea of sending Britain and France's like old bunch of ships that are really outdated, sending them up through the Dardanelles Straits, which is where Constantinople is, because the Black Sea is the north of Turkey, and that's and Russia is up there too. It's really hard to supply Russia with help because the only other route available is through the Arctic, and that sucks. So having another route to the Black Sea would help Russia a lot, and that's why this kind of campaign kicks off. And at the time, the British didn't really have enough troops, mainly British troops, so they used the Australians and New Zealanders. And those two groups are what this battle is namely known for. This battle is incredibly important to Australian and New Zealander culture. It ended in a defeat. It was one of the most stupidest, horribly mismanaged battles of the war. And like it says up there, it was like its version of D-Day, but it lasted 10 months and it didn't do anything. And they left afterwards. It was horrible. It was completely useless. If you look at the battlefield, you look at the landing sites, the Turks see everything. They saw everything happening on the beaches, and they could just do whatever. And the Allies didn't do anything about that. Now, this actually isn't just an Australian New Zealander show, though, too. A lot of peoples actually fought in this battle, and it's actually kind of a smorgasbord of cultures. On the Allied side, you had Canadians, actually Newfoundlanders, who were actually the first North Americans to fight in the war. Other Canadians, the French were there too, as well as Indians and South Africans. And on the Ottoman side, you had, again, Ottoman Empire being a multicultural nation, they had Turks, Arabs, Armenians, and even a few Germans as well. So it was this kind of just collective, diverse cesspit of fighting that happened. And this battle is one of the highlights of the idea that this war was fought over nothing and millions died for nothing. Because after 10 months, the Allies just leave. They know that the position is terrible. The head of the war minister, I think he's the Minister of War, I don't remember his real title, but Kitchener, forget his first name, but he was a very top guy in the British Empire for the military, and he went over to Gallipoli because he thought it's not that bad. The second he sees the beach, he goes, "Oh God, we need to leave now." And it was that bad, and these people went through these conditions to try and fight through this hellish kind of landscape of having everything imaginable seeing you and being able to shoot you and kill you, and being able to get through that. And that's hell. That is a form of hell. And the game doesn't. It decides to go into a war movie trope territory. The game, you are a veteran Australian who has a young guy under his wing, and he's a runner. And runners were used to run messages to different areas of the line. Because again, radio wasn't that big. Carrier pigeons were very, spotty, so usually units would resort to that. So the game has you running around places to, go, and eventually it ends up with you assaulting this Ottoman fort by yourself in this heroic self-sacrificial of like getting everybody out of there. But I'm the old vet because I'm old, I can die, and nobody will feel bad, so I'll just do it. It doesn't really touch anything on that. And this battle was incredibly culturally significant, not just to the Australians and New Zealanders and all the other allied cultures that fought, but also to the Turks. The founder of Turkey, Ataturk, he fought in this battle, and he would actually become a famous figure. And one of his famous orders was, I don't expect you to hold, I expect you to die. Not exactly quote unquote, but close enough. But really, like I said, this battle represents the futility of what these men went through. Going into these same areas again and again to maybe this time it'll work from people who didn't know what they were doing. These officers didn't know, you can't really blame them for not knowing what to do at the time because you had to experiment with, so you had to know what would work or not. But for years of just constantly men just being thrown like animals to slaughter, it's awful. And this, again, does this represent that? No, it really doesn't. Now, for our last part, it'll actually go to an actually interesting part of the war, which is the Middle East. And we mentioned the Ottomans in the Middle East, and this feeds into that. Lawrence of Arabia, if you've heard, is the title of a famous movie, one of the greatest movies of all time in cinema history. But Lawrence of Arabia was actually a real figure. He was, I forget his actual names in the abbreviations, but his real name was T.E. Lawrence. And he was an archaeologist, and he was chosen during the war to help out with tribes in the Arabian Peninsula to revolt against the Ottomans. And it was a giant what was known as the Arab Revolt. The British poured tons of money and equipment to this on the hopes that these cultures, like the Arabs or all these different kind of, I don't know them off the top of my head, but all these different kind of cultural groups, they made all these promises to them, like, yep, if we get this and you win, we'll let you have all this territory, you'll have your own home. And instead, they just kind of broke all their promises to everybody. And Lawrence was kind of a part of that, and he helped advise these tribes to organize and fight the Ottomans. But Lawrence was a different kind of guy. He's an interesting kind of character. Not really a lot is known really about, not a lot is known about him concretely. There's a lot written about him. He's written a lot. Part of why he's famous is the way he writes. It's incredible. If you read his writings, he's a very good writer. He's very vivid with his writing. But there's not a lot of sources to confirm whether or not what he said happened. One of these stories being that he was out on a patrol in the desert, and he gets captured by an Ottoman cavalry patrol. He gets brought to the local Ottoman governor in a nearby town. I think it was Damascus. And he is beaten, tortured, sexually abused, thrown into a prison, and where an Armenian doctor helped him escape. Did this actually happen? I don't know. There's not really any accounts. It could have happened. I'm not saying it didn't, but there's not really anything. The only other thing to confirm it was the actual governor's family said this was nonsense, and that to add on to that, the governor, before he was married, was quite the womanizer, so he wouldn't do something like that. So that story is just an example of all these different tales he tells, and no one really knows if they actually happened. And there's not a lot about him known as well, because when you read his biography and his writings, he's a very hard guy to pin down, who he is and what he believes in. But what he firmly believed in was the Arabs. He absolutely adored and loved these people. He would go into the region to do archaeological digs before the war, and he greatly respected Arabs. which was unique because at that time, we're talking about a time period which is one of the most racist in human history, where the idea that the white race is above all else and they need to spread their knowledge and enlightenment to the others, that was considered scientific fact at the time. It's ridiculous now and horrible, but at the time that was considered, yeah, that's a fact. And his view was that we could learn a thing or two from Arabs. And that was a radically different idea at the time. He loved these people. They were incredibly generous to him, and he repaid them tenfold. And he felt more at home in like the Middle East than he did in Britain. He would actually be the first person to refuse a knighthood in England because he was so upset with how the British handled the division of the Middle East into regions that were not decided on via any national or cultural or religious differences at all. They just divided up wholesale. That's actually kind of why we have the problems in the Middle East that we have today, because of that. And that, that's another aspect, like I mentioned earlier, of how this war affected us now, in that it's like a ripple effect, like something drops in a body of water and kind of ripples out, and that's kind of what the Middle East had. Now, in the game, you don't really play as Lawrence. He's a big character, but he narrates the whole thing. Your character might as well not even exist. You play as a Bedouin woman, and the Bedouins were a tribe in the around the area. I don't know exactly which general region. I just know it's like around the area. And they fought with Lawrence, and they helped him with the revolt and everything. Did women fight in it? I think so. I don't know for sure. I didn't really read too much into the Bedouins myself. But on a side note, women were actually kind of pretty active in World War I. There's a number of famous women who made their mark by, in this war. And their stories were not really told in this either. So that's cool. But, it doesn't really, it's just, again, another war trope, just like, this woman who has suffered a family tragedy against the occupying power and, wanting revenge and all that. That's the story of that. And it doesn't really tell you anything about Lawrence. It doesn't tell you anything about the Middle East or how the British essentially ruined the region for a century. And that's not shown at all. It's not even told. It's just another basic war movie trope. That's what you would describe this campaign as. It's just tropes. So I'm going to ask this question one more time. Does this represent the actual event? Fuck no. No, it does not. So in general, no, the game does not. And I think that DICE, they had the material. The material is there to make actual really good, like, cinematic video game stories that would work and would actually tell the story of those events, and they don't do it. And I don't know if I don't think they maliciously do that. Video game development is a very complicated process. They probably couldn't do enough of what they did, and also maybe because they're Scandinavian, and Scandinavians don't have that. They don't have the cultural respect that they do of other countries. If this game was made by like a developer in Britain or France or maybe even like Germany or the United States, it would turn out a lot differently, because like I said before, those cultures and those peoples hold these events so dearly to that national consciousness that people, if you read like comments about this game, like in well, you can't look at NeoGAF anymore, but like online, and just see how like all these people from Europe are upset because they have family members that died in the war, and like they're mad that this is representing that like poorly, and it's that important to some people, and it's kind of hard to really it's hard to really tell these kind of stories in games too, because these stories are bleak. These stories are really depressing. And I have a couple of actual war stories I'd like to tell you, and these are excerpts from actual soldiers and people who lived through this conflict. There's not a lot. We don't have a lot of time. I think I'm just going to tell you one, because I have 5 minutes. So I'm going to give you the one, if I can find it. And this is an account from a Captain Charles May. He was a British captain, a British officer in the, obviously the British Army. I can find his little thing here. Captain Charles May, 22nd Battalion, Manchester Regiment, 91st Brigade, 7th Division. A big mouthful, I know. This is a letter he wrote home. And before I say this, I want to preface this with, it's hard for us to look at people who lived back then as relatable. Because, you know, it's almost like you look at your grandparents and it's like, you know, you obviously love them because they're your grandparents. But in terms of like sometimes it depends. But sometimes it could be hard to relate to people like that because they essentially live in a different world. And it's like that when you're reading these accounts and everything, because part of it is because the English is different, and part of it is because these people are different people than us. They hold different values and everything, so you have that with you. But when I read this to you, this could be any one of us. And, you know, it adds to that personal kind of aspect of the war for people. This is his letter, Captain Charles May. This is his letter he wrote home. He wrote home to his wife, his pregnant wife. Quote, "I must not allow myself to dwell on the personal. There is no room for it here. Also, it is demoralizing, but I do not want to die. Not that I mind for myself. If it be that I am to go, I am ready. But the thought that I may never see you or our darling baby again turns my bowels to water. I cannot think of it with even the semblance of equanimity. My own consolation is the happiness that has been ours. Also, my conscience is clear that I have always tried to make life a joy to you. I know at least that if I go, you will not want. That is something. But it is the thought that we may be cut off from one another, which is so terrible, and that our babe may grow up without my knowing her and her knowing me. It's difficult to face, and I know your life without me would be a dull blank, yet you must never let it become wholly so, for to you will be left the greatest charge of the world, in all the world, the upbringing of our baby. God bless that child, she's the hope of life to me. My darling, au revoir. It may be well that you will only have to read these lines as passing interest. On the other hand, they may very well be my last message to you. If they are, know through all your life that I loved you, and baby, with all my heart and soul, that you two sweet things were just all the world to me. I pray God I may do my duty, for I know, whatever that may entail, you would not have it otherwise. Captain Charles May, 22nd Battalion, Manchester Regiment, 91st Brigade, 7th Division." Captain Charles May would indeed be killed the next day at the Battle of the Somme. He would leave behind his wife and a daughter. When you're studying these events, when you're reading about the battles and the accounts, and you eventually start looking at the figures, at the casualty numbers, and it starts getting mind-numbing. It's almost as if your brain is preventing you from trying to visualize that because it's that awful. You can picture it. You can think of a picture in your head of how that would look like, of how a field of 500,000 dead bodies would look. But no, it won't come close to the real thing. And that adversely affected us as people. And there's a quote that's attributed to Joseph Stalin, that particularly nice guy, who the quote is, and you see this in Call of Duty when you die too, it's cool, but it's one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And when you read these battles and you look at these numbers, it very much looks like just a list of statistics. But the thing you have to remember is that it's not. You know, 750,000 dead people. They're not just numbers. Those are 750,000 dead Charles Mays. People who had families, loved ones, and that got ripped away from them for nothing. Absolutely nothing. But at the same time, because of that, we live in the world that created. And it's incredibly important to learn from that. There's a saying amongst historians, people who love history, and it's a very overused saying, and people roll their eyes when you hear it because it's so oversaid. But it's those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And the reason it's said so much is because people don't learn it. And if we never want to see something like this ever happening again, And you might think, well, it couldn't happen these days. And maybe, but maybe not. You really don't undersell us. We are very much capable of fucking ourselves up. But if we don't take heed on these stories of these Charles Mays and Ernst Youngers and all the other people who survived and, you know, brought what that affected to the stage of society, you know, that needs to be taken heed of, because this kind of thing, even though the Second World War was much bigger and grander and more people died in it and all that, and it was needed, something like this can't ever, ever, ever happen again. And it's up to us to make sure it doesn't happen again. And with that, that'll do it for this panel to End All Wars. Thank you guys so much for coming. It was a lot more than I thought would come, so thank you so much for your time. If you are interested in the rest of my exploits, I'm actually planning to do something of a series of YouTube on this on YouTube. I don't have the channel ready, but you can follow me on my Twitch. It's Derpsburg. The URL's blue. It wasn't supposed to be, but okay. And my Twitter is right there. If you're interested in my exploits, if you want to hit a follow, that'd be appreciated. Thank you for coming along for the ride. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Mag Labs. Thank you.